Welcome everybody to Victor's Forbidden Desire. Please do enjoy this next video.
The barn is dark except for one swinging lantern. Colt stands frozen in the doorway, hands balled at his sides, breath coming hard. Across from him, Hector has gone completely still. That terrifying stillness he gets when something has finally broken through the wall he spent 8 years building stone by stone. Between them on the floor, the rope, unraveled. Andre Solis standing in the shadows behind Colt, with an expression that says he now understands everything he was never supposed to see. Nobody moves, nobody breathes, because what happens in the next 30 seconds will either destroy this, the ranch, the trust, the thing neither of them has ever said aloud but both have been living inside for months, or make it permanent. Hector's smoke-colored eyes find Colt across the dark. He says one word. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The rope was still swinging when Colt DeVoe walked into the barn. Not a man's rope, not a hanging rope, but the long, braided lasso Hector Vane had been working all morning, 12 inches at a time, pulling and knotting the leather with hands that never seemed to hurry, never seemed to fumble, hands that knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need anyone watching. But someone was watching. Colt had been watching for 3 weeks now, ever since he'd hired on at the Vane spread with nothing to his name but a bedroll, a dented canteen, and the kind of reckless pride that passes for courage in a 22-year-old who's never been taught the difference. Hector hadn't asked his age, hadn't asked much of anything, just studied him with those flat, smoke-colored eyes, the way a man studies weather on the horizon, not with fear, not with welcome, just with the calm certainty that whatever was coming, he'd already survived worse. "Get on your knees, boy," Hector said. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Hector Vane that had lodged itself somewhere under Colt's ribs like a splinter he couldn't reach. The man's voice was the same temperature, whether he was talking about fence posts or philosophy, or the particular way a man ought to kneel in the dirt beside a newborn calf that was struggling to find its legs. Because that was what he meant. That was always what he meant. And Colt hated himself a little for the half-second it took his pulse to understand that. He dropped to his knees in the straw beside the calf. Its sides heaved in shallow, panicked rhythms. "You saw it," Hector said, moving to crouch on the other side, the rope coiled now over his shoulder. "You saw it come into the world and you still just stood there." Colt said nothing. The calf's eyes were huge and brown and terrified, exactly the way Colt felt and refused to show. "You gonna keep standing in doorways your whole life?" Hector asked, "or you gonna learn to walk through them?" It wasn't a question. Hector reached across the calf and positioned Colt's hands, not gently, not roughly, but with the precise authority of a man who had no patience for hesitation and no cruelty in him either. Just this absolute insistence that things be done right. Colt's jaw tightened. He could feel the warmth radiating off Hector's forearms through the thin cotton of his own shirt, could smell sawdust and horses and something darker underneath, like cedar smoke at the end of a long day. He focused on the calf. It lived. 20 minutes later, it found its legs. Hector stood and wiped his hands on his trousers and didn't look at Colt the way Colt was looking at him, like a man trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. He just picked up his rope and walked back to the post where he'd been working, and continued, 12 inches at a time, pulling the leather through his grip in long, even strokes that Colt watched from across the barn, until the light changed and it was time to haul water. 3 weeks before this, Colt had arrived in Perdition, Texas, on a horse that was given up the same way he was, slowly, with dignity, but given up. He'd left his father's place in the Panhandle with half a season's wages and a letter of introduction from a man his father had called decent, which in Panhandle terms meant the man probably hadn't cheated you recently. The letter was for a rancher named Vane, who ran 500 head on the eastern edge of the Perdition Basin, a stretch of land so flat and so dry that the horizon seemed to lean away from you no matter which direction you faced. Colt had heard stories about the basin, that the wind there had a voice, that the cattle ran bigger and stranger, that the man who owned the land had come from somewhere north and never talked about where, or why. What he hadn't heard, because no one in perdition seemed inclined to say it out loud, was what Hector Vane looked like. Tall in the way that some men are tall. Not dramatically, not as a performance, but simply as a fact. The way a cliff face is tall. The way a thing just is what it is. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been past 40. A jaw that looked like it had been decided upon firmly and not reconsidered. And those eyes. Colt had been unprepared for those eyes, which looked at him for exactly 3 seconds when he handed over the letter of introduction, and then looked at the letter, and then looked back at him and said, "You ride?" Colt said yes. "You cook?" Colt said passively. Hector said, "Good enough," and that had been the interview. The bunkhouse held 2 other hands, Peso and a boy everyone called Jin, who was perhaps 17 and spoke mostly in gestures. They were friendly in the easy, uncomplicated way of men who work hard enough that friendliness costs them nothing. Neither of them seemed to find anything unusual about Hector Vane or the particular quality of silence he carried around himself like a second coat. On Colt's first night, lying in his bunk, listening to Peso snore and watching moonlight move across the ceiling, he told himself the strange pressure in his chest was exhaustion. On the second night, he told himself it was altitude, though the basin was practically sea level. By the third night, he had stopped telling himself anything and simply lay there with the feeling, which was easier. What he noticed first was the rope work. Hector was never idle, and when he wasn't moving cattle or mending fence or making the kind of grinding decisions that running a spread required, he was working leather, braiding, knotting, pulling, shaping. Colt had seen rope work before, had done some himself, but not like this. Hector's hands had a quality of conversation with whatever they were holding, a kind of patient, ongoing dialogue between intention and material. Colt caught himself staring on the 4th morning and looked away and spent the next hour being aggressively useful in the far corner of the yard. He didn't catch himself staring after that. He was more careful. He watched from angles, from peripheral vision, from just inside the barn door, with the light behind him, so he was mostly shadow, and Hector was mostly light. He told himself this was fine. This was just curiosity. He had always been a curious person. He was curious about rope work. He was an excellent liar. The basin had its own weather, which everyone in perdition understood, and visitors did not. It wasn't the storms that came through occasionally, violent and brief as arguments, nor the general dryness that cracked the earth in patterns that looked like old maps. It was the heat, not the surface heat that beat down from above, but the heat that rose from below, from the red rock and pale dust, as if the land itself was running a fever. By noon in late summer, the air between the main house and the barn became a living thing, shimmering and thick so that shapes at a distance seemed to breathe. Colt had been there 6 days when the first fence line came down in the southwest quarter. Not from cattle, from a storm that had moved through at 2 in the morning with no warning and left a quarter mile of posts flat in the dust. Hector had them saddled before dawn. All 4 of them rode out in the violet dark, the horses nervous and tossing their heads at the smell of the wet earth, and Hector rode at the front without a lantern because he could apparently navigate his own land by something other than sight, by feel, by some internal map written into him over years of covering the same ground in every possible condition. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, Peso and Jin on the far end, Colt alongside Hector in the middle stretch where the posts had come down worst. Hector didn't give unnecessary instructions, which Colt had learned to appreciate. He watched once and then expected, and the expectation was itself a kind of respect. They fell into a rhythm, muscle and leverage and the thud of posts going back into the earth, sweat darkening both their shirts within the first hour. Even the sun climbing and the heat rising from below to meet it. At some point, Colt became aware that they were working in near-perfect sync, his movement and Hector's, anticipating, compensating, filling in, and the awareness of it sent a complicated wave through him that he converted immediately into extra effort. He drove the next post harder than it needed. Hector glanced at him sideways. The glance said nothing and everything. Colt looked back at the fence line. At midday, they stopped to water the horses, and Hector handed Colt a piece of dried meat and sat on a rock with his hat tilted against the sun and didn't speak for a long time. Colt sat nearby in the narrow shade of his horse. The land stretched in every direction like a held breath. "Where are you from?" Hector said finally. "Panhandle," Colt said. Hector nodded, as if this confirmed something. "You running toward or away?" he said. Colt looked at him. Hector's eyes were still on the horizon. "It's usually one or the other," he added, with no particular judgment in the observation. Colt thought about this longer than he should have. "Toward," he said eventually. Hector nodded again, and stood and put on his hat and went back to the fence line, and the conversation was over. But something about it wasn't over. Something about it was still going on under the surface of every remaining hour of that day in the space between them. The trouble with Hector Vane, Colt decided around the end of his second week, was that he was not unaware. That was the thing. Some men had that quality, a certain fundamental unawareness of themselves and of the effect they produced, an innocence about it. Those men were easy to be around. Hector was not that. Hector was, in some essential way, entirely aware of exactly what he was doing at every moment, and this awareness extended, Colt had come to believe, to other people in his immediate vicinity, which meant that when Colt stood a little too still for a little too long, while Hector worked the new rope in the doorway of the barn, Hector knew. When Colt's voice dropped half a register for no apparent reason during a perfectly ordinary conversation about water rights, Hector knew that too. He never said anything. He never indicated it by so much as a lifted eyebrow. But the knowledge was there in the room between them, an additional presence, patient and undemanding, like a fire burning in an adjoining room that you couldn't see but could feel through the wall. What Colt did not know, and was perhaps not supposed to know yet, was what Hector intended to do with that knowledge, or whether intention was even the right word for something that seemed to be moving at its own pace and in its own direction, like water finding its level. Peso left on a Friday for a cousin's wedding in Del Rio and wasn't coming back until Monday. Gin came down with a summer fever and was asleep in the bunkhouse by the time the sun went down, which left the main house with one lamp burning in the kitchen window and the yard with the sound of Hector's boots on the porch steps and the barn with its warm darkness and the smell of horses and fresh-cut leather and Colt standing in the middle of it all, having just walked in on Hector doing exactly what he'd been doing every evening, working the rope, measuring it out, in 12 inches at a time. Except that this evening, there was no one else on the property who could accidentally interrupt, and both of them knew it. Hector looked up. He had the rope in both hands, pulled taut between them, and he looked at Colt the way he looked at everything, with that complete, unhurried attention that made you feel simultaneously seen and tested. "You saw it," he said. His voice in the enclosed space of the barn was a different thing than it was outdoors. Closer, more resonant, carrying further in the way that voices do when the air has nowhere else to go. Colt nodded. His throat was dry. He was aware of the sound of his own breathing and making a significant effort to normalize it. "Now get on your knees," Hector said. Colt blinked, and then Hector held up the rope with a faint, patient expression that made clear, absolutely, immediately, without any possible ambiguity, that he was talking about the floor of the barn, where a second coil of rough braided leather had come unraveled and lay tangled in the straw, and that what he required was for Colt to kneel beside it and help him work it back into order, which was a thing that required two people and was easier from close to the ground. Colt's face did something complicated that he hoped the lamplight was too dim to fully illuminate. He crossed the barn and knelt beside the tangled coil. Hector crouched across from him, and they began working in silence, and the silence was the loudest thing Colt had ever been inside. Here is what happened after that, and here is what did not. What happened? They worked the rope for 40 minutes. Their hands occasionally brushing in the straw, the lamp burning low, the horses shifting softly in their stalls. At some point, Hector said, "You're not bad at this." And Colt said, "I had a good teacher." And the words came out with more honesty than he'd intended, and Hector was quiet for a moment with a particular quality of quiet that pressed against the air. When the rope was done, Hector wound it and hung it on the post and turned and sat against the barn wall with one knee up and looked at Colt the way you look at a question you've been sitting with long enough to be ready for the answer. What did not happen? Nothing and everything. The distance between two people who both know something and have not yet said it. "You're staying," Hector said finally. It wasn't a question, but it had the shape of one. Something offered rather than stated, something that required a response. Colt looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight caught the angles of Hector's face, the gray at his temples, the steady patience in his eyes. "Yeah," Colt said. "I think I am." Hector nodded. Slow, deliberate, the way he did everything. "Good," he said. And that single word landed with the weight of something much longer, much more complex, a whole conversation compressed into 4 letters, and Colt carried it back to the bunkhouse and lay awake with it for a long time, while the night outside breathed and the basin settled into its own slow dark. The next morning was ordinary in the way that mornings are ordinary when something has shifted but has not yet been named. Coffee on the stove and horses needing water, and Peso still gone and Gin still feverish and Hector at the fence line, already when Colt came out into the blue and dawn. But there was a difference in the orientation of things, some subtle realignment. The way a door that has always been slightly off-kilter suddenly hangs true. Hector handed Colt a hammer without looking at him, and Colt took it, and they worked the fence in their now practiced silence. And the silence was a different kind of silence than it had been before. It had an interior now. It had rooms in it. That afternoon, Colt was watering the horses when he became aware of Hector standing behind him, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough that Colt could feel the changed quality of the air. He didn't turn around. "You asked me something," Hector said. His voice low and carrying the particular texture it had in enclosed spaces, though they were standing in the open. Colt kept his hands busy with the water bucket. "I asked you a lot of things," Colt said. "You asked me once if I got lonely out here." Hector paused. "That's the one I've been thinking about." Colt set down the bucket. He turned around. Hector was looking at him with those flat, smoke-colored eyes that weren't flat at all. He had come to understand. They just kept the surface still, while everything else moved underneath. "For a man who spent 8 years alone," Colt said carefully, "I figure you either made your peace with lonely or you didn't." Hector said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the yard between them, carrying dust and the smell of dry grass and heat. "I didn't," Hector said finally, and he said it simply, without theater, the way he said everything, as a fact that had been tested and found to be true, and was no longer worth the energy of pretending otherwise. Colt looked at him. Hector looked back. The afternoon heat shimmered between them and around them, and the horses drank quietly from the trough, and the basin stretched to every horizon, flat and enormous and indifferent to what was happening in this one small corner of it, which was this: 2 men standing in a yard, close enough that the next step, in any direction, was a choice. Peso came back Sunday instead of Monday, which was Peso's way. Arriving when expected was something he regarded as optional. He rode in late afternoon to find the horses watered and the south fence mended, and Colt sitting on the porch with coffee, and Hector inside, making the kind of quiet domestic sounds that meant he was cooking. Which he did when he was in a particular mood that Peso couldn't precisely name, but had noticed over 2 years of employment and filed away with other things he had noticed and chosen not to comment on. He put his horse up and came and sat on the porch and accepted the coffee Colt poured without being asked and looked out at the basin going gold in the late light. "You settling in all right?" he said. Colt said yeah. Peso nodded. "Hector's a good man," he said. "Takes some patience to understand him." Colt said nothing, which was itself an answer. Peso looked at him sideways with the expression of a man who has survived long enough to know when a conversation doesn't need his participation. He drank his coffee. The land turned orange and then red and then violet. Inside the house, something was frying. It smelled like the end of a long day that had gone right. The rope was finished by Thursday of the 3rd week. Hector stretched it between his hands in the barn doorway in the morning light and turned it slowly, checking the tension, the evenness of the braid, the way each 12-inch section folded into the next with no weakness and no gap. It was a good rope. It was the kind of work you looked at and felt the weight of the time it had taken and thought, yes, this was worth it. Colt came out of the bunkhouse and crossed the yard and stopped a few feet away. Hector held it up. "Each take an end," he said. Colt crossed the remaining distance and took the end of the rope, and Hector pulled gently, and Colt felt the tension travel through the braid and up through his hands and into his arms, a slow, testing pressure. "Good," Hector said. He was looking at the rope, but not only at the rope. Strong, Colt held on. The morning was cool and the light was clean, and somewhere behind the barn, a rooster had made its announcement and been ignored. "How long did that take you?" Colt asked. Hector looked up, both of them holding the rope between them. "About as long as things take," Hector said, "when you don't rush them." The words sat in the air. Neither of them moved. The rope ran between their hands like a sentence still being finished, like a question still warm from the asking. He liked the particular kind of beginning that only looks like a beginning when you are already some distance past it and can look back and recognize the moment for what it was. Hector's eyes on his. Smoke-colored and still at the surface, and nothing still beneath. Colt held on. There is a particular hour in the high desert, somewhere between the last of the afternoon and the first of the evening, when the light turns a color that has no name in any language Colt knew. Not gold, not amber, not the particular burnt orange of sundown, but something between all three, something that makes the whole land look like the inside of a memory. He had come to think of it as Hector's hour, which was an embarrassing thing to think, and which he thought anyway, because the first time he had truly looked at Hector, truly seen him, without defenses, and without the careful management of his own attention, it had been in that light, and the image had written itself somewhere he couldn't reach to revise it. Hector didn't speak about feeling. He wasn't built for it in the way that some men weren't built for certain kinds of weather. It wasn't weakness, just constitution. But he spoke through action with the same precision other men used for words. And once Colt had learned to read that language, he found it said more, and said it truer, than most spoken sentences he'd heard in his life. A cup of coffee left on the fence post exactly where Colt had been working. A blanket appearing on his bunk after a cold night ride without discussion of where it came from. The particular way Hector's shoulder settled when Colt came to stand beside him at the end of a day. Not the posture of a man bracing or performing or maintaining a careful distance, but the posture of a man who has let something down. This was how it was. This was how it continued. Slow as rope work. Patient as the basin itself. Some things in the desert took years to bloom. Everybody who lived there knew this, and most of them had made a kind of peace with it, and the few who hadn't had left for somewhere faster, somewhere easier, somewhere the ground gave up its gifts without requiring anything in return. Hector was still here. That said everything. Colt was still here too. By the end of the third week, he had stopped counting that as a surprise. The night of the summer's first real storm, the kind that built all day and arrived at midnight with no apology, the bunkhouse roof began to leak in the back corner above Gin's bunk. Gin, recovered from his fever, relocated his blankets with the philosophical acceptance of someone accustomed to inconvenience, and Peso slept through everything as Peso always did, and Colt lay awake listening to the rain hammer the basin flat. After an hour, he got up. He didn't tell himself why. He pulled on his boots and his coat and crossed the yard through the downpour, rain coming at him sideways, and climbed the porch steps and raised his hand to knock on the main house door. It opened before he knocked. Hector was standing there in the lamplight, fully dressed, as if he had been awake the same way and for the same reason. He looked at Colt. Colt looked at him. Rain drove against the porch roof and the yard was already running with shallow rivers and the lightning was somewhere far off doing its work over the basin. "Come in," Hector said. His voice in the threshold of his own house, in the middle of the night, in the rain, was the same temperature it always was, but something underneath it was different. The same difference Colt had felt in the barn 3 days ago. The same interior space in the silence. Colt stepped through the door. Hector poured 2 cups of coffee, black, from a pot that had been kept warm, and they sat at the kitchen table and listened to the storm work through and outside the window. The lamp threw their reflections against the glass. 2 men sitting across from each other in a small house while the world outside moved in great loud sheets. And Colt looked at his own reflection, and then at Hector's, and then at Hector himself. The real one sitting 4 feet away with his hands wrapped around his cup and his eyes on the table, and something in the set of his shoulders that Colt recognized as the same thing he himself had been carrying for 3 weeks, which was the weight of something known and not yet said. "Hector," Colt said. Hector looked up. The rain said the rest. What happened next happened slowly, the way everything happened between them. Not in a rush, not with the theatrical urgency of men who didn't trust themselves to hold still. Hector set down his cup. He looked at Colt the way he had looked at the rope when it was finished, with the settled, quiet satisfaction of recognizing something that had been built right. The storm was still going outside. Neither of them moved toward the other. They didn't need to. The distance between them had been shrinking by degrees for 3 weeks, measured out in 12-inch increments like the braiding of something that would hold, and what was left of it now was just enough to be aware of, just enough to feel as a thing separate from themselves that they were both inhabiting. "I've been alone a long time," Hector said. His voice was low and careful, the voice he used when he was saying something that mattered and wanted to be accurate about it. "I stopped expecting that to change." Colt watched him. The lamp threw long shadows across the table between them. "What changed it?" Colt asked. Hector looked at him steadily. "You rode in on a dying horse," he said, and looked at me like I was something worth riding toward. And Colt felt that settle into him somewhere deep and permanent. He held it there. He didn't say anything for a moment because what Hector had just said had the quality of something that had been carried for a while before being set down, and it deserved the space. "You could have said something sooner," Colt said finally, and there was no accusation in it, just the observation. Hector gave the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "I was making sure the rope would hold," he said. Outside, the lightning came again, farther off now, the storm beginning its retreat eastward across the basin. The thunder followed after a long pause, muted and rolling, the way thunder sounds when it is leaving rather than arriving. Colt reached across the table. He set his hand on the back of Hector's, in palm down, not gripping, just present. The gesture he had watched Hector make with injured animals. The declaration of, "I am here and I am not leaving." Hector looked down at it. Then he turned his hand over and his fingers closed around Colt's, and that was that. That was the beginning, or the end of the beginning, which are sometimes the same moment. Morning came the way desert mornings came after storms. Scrubbed clean, luminous, the sky a shade of blue that seemed invented overnight. Every surface gleamed. The air smelled of wet stone and green things trying to happen. Colt woke in the main house, in the spare room off the kitchen where Hector had made up a cot sometime after midnight, when the rain showed no sign of stopping, and the walk back to the bunkhouse had seemed increasingly beside the point. He lay still for a moment, listening to the changed quality of the world outside and the familiar sounds from the kitchen, the stove being fed, the coffee pot settling into its work, and felt the particular unfamiliar sensation of a morning that was not lonely. He had not realized how accustomed he had grown to the weight of that, how thoroughly it had become part of the fabric of waking up, until the morning he woke up without it. He dressed and came into the kitchen. Hector was at the stove with his back to the door, broad-shouldered in the early light, steam rising from the pot. He heard Colt come in. He always heard everything, but didn't turn right away. "Set cups on the table," Colt said. "I know where they are." Hector turned then, and the expression on his face was not dramatically different from his ordinary expression. Eat, but there was something at the edges of it, something settled and open, like a window that had been painted shut for years and had finally been worked free. Colt held that expression in his chest for a moment. Then he got the cups down from the shelf and set them on the table, and they had coffee, and the sun came fully up over the basin, and the day began. Peso noticed. Of course Peso noticed. Peso noticed everything and remarked on almost nothing, which was a quality Colt had come to appreciate deeply. On the first morning after the storm, Peso came in from the bunkhouse to find the main house showing signs of having contained 2 people overnight. 2 cups already washed and drying. He had 2 chairs pulled out from the table, and he looked at this evidence with the expression of a man who has suspected something for some time and finds the confirmation less surprising than the relief. He said nothing. He poured his coffee and went out to check on the south fence, and that was the whole of it. Jin, who was 17 and had been paying attention to everything in the way that 17-year-olds do when they are trying to understand how the world works, asked Peso about it later by the water trough in a series of gestures and raised eyebrows that constituted his primary mode of interrogation. Peso shrugged, which was its own kind of answer, the kind that said, "This is the shape of the thing, and the shape is fine, and that's all you need." The change did not announce itself. It moved through the ranch like the seasons moved through the basin. Gradually, with evidence accumulating before the fact became undeniable, Colt moved his gear from the bunkhouse at the end of the 4th week, without ceremony, carrying his bedroll and his saddlebag and his one good coat across the yard in the evening, while Peso held the bunkhouse door open with a hand and watched with the expression of a man presiding over something minor and correct. Hector was at the barn when this happened and came out to find Colt setting his things down in the spare room and looked at this without comment, and then came and stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Colt, and Colt looked back at him, and that was the conversation. Then Hector went back to the barn because there were horses to check on, and the day wasn't over. And Colt unpacked his bag and put his things on the shelf next to the window and stood for a moment, looking at the basin in the evening light. It looked different from here. It looked like somewhere a person could stay. Here is something no one had told Colt about Hector Vane, which he discovered over the weeks that followed, which was that the man talked more at night. Not dramatically, not in the way of men who had been lonely so long that once they started they couldn't stop. It wasn't that kind of talking. It was quiet and occasional, the kind of talking that happens when the work is done and the dark is full and there is someone beside you who knows how to listen. He told Colt about the north, where he had come from, a place called Millhaven that was cold 9 months of the year and gray 6 of those 9, even where he had worked his father's land until his father died, and then kept working it until he understood that the land held nothing for him, not because of any failure of the land, but because of what he was and what the north had for men like him, which was silence of a different kind than this desert silence. Not the silence of space, but the silence of doors closed and kept closed. The silence of being known and not spoken of. The silence of a man who had learned to contain himself so thoroughly that the container had become the only part of him anyone ever touched. He had come south on a rumor. Someone at a stock sale in Abilene who'd mentioned the Perdition Basin and its particular quality of indifference, how the land didn't care what a man was so long as he could work it. Hector had ridden 3 weeks to find out if this was true. He had stayed 8 years. It was true, in the way that most useful truths were true, partially, imperfectly, with exceptions, but enough to build something on. Colt listened to all of this in the dark, with the feeling of a man being given something he hadn't known he needed, something that explained the shape of things, the high fences, the empty rooms, the particular way Hector held himself in town, a little apart, facing outward, watchful, the posture of a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. "I understand that," Colt said one night. And Hector was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know you do." And that was the deepest thing either of them said for a while, because understanding and being understood are 2 different gifts, and they had just exchanged both of them at once. The next time they rode to Perdition for supplies, the man at the general store A wide, ruddy-faced individual named Briggs, who regarded himself as the repository of the town's social conscience, looked at them both over the counter with the expression of a man assembling a question he wasn't sure he was going to like the answer to. Hector looked back at him with the flat, complete patience of a man who had been enduring exactly this expression for 8 years and had long since stopped finding it difficult. Colt stood beside him at the counter with his shoulder almost touching Hector's and felt Briggs's gaze move between them and did not move away. He had spent enough of his life managing other people's discomfort. He had ridden towards something. He intended to arrive. Briggs seemed to decide the question wasn't worth the conversation. He tallied their order. Hector paid. They loaded the wagon and rode back to the ranch in the particular comfortable silence that had become the medium they lived in. Not empty, not avoidant, just shared. The way good land is shared by the things growing in it, each taking up space without diminishing the other. "You never feel like leaving?" Colt asked at some point on that ride, the basin opening around them in the late afternoon, the light doing what it always did at this hour. Hector thought about it for the length of a slow mile. "Used to," he said. "Not anymore." "Why not?" Colt asked, though he already knew. Hector looked at him sideways. "You know why?" he said. Colt did know. He looked ahead at the road and felt it in his chest, that warm, weighted thing that he had stopped trying to name and had started simply carrying the way you carry something precious, carefully, with both hands, aware of how easily it could be lost, and therefore how important it was not to lose it. The rope Hector had finished now hung in the barn doorway, looped over its post. It had become a kind of landmark, the thing Colt's eye went to first when he crossed the yard in the morning, the way you check a compass bearing, just to confirm the direction. It was an excellent rope. It was strong and even, and would last for years, the kind of work that doesn't announce itself, but that you come to trust absolutely because it has never failed under your hands. Colt touched it sometimes when he passed, briefly, without thinking about it. The same way he had learned to touch the things that mattered, not grabbing, not holding on too tight, just present, just true. Hector watched him do this once, from across the yard, and said nothing. His expression said enough. The last week of summer came down on the basin like a final declaration. The heat built to a peak so absolute it had its own quality of silence. All the small sounds of the land suspended, the insects gone quiet, the horses standing still in their stalls with their heads low and their breathing slow, as if the heat required their full cooperation to endure. Colt and Hector worked in the early mornings before the sun climbed fully and rested in the deep afternoon hours in the shade of the porch, drinking water and sitting in their adjacent silences, in close enough to feel the other's presence without needing to confirm it. On the last night of August, the temperature broke. Not with a storm this time, with a quiet surrender. The heat simply releasing its hold in the small hours of the morning. The air turning cool and then cold. The stars coming out with the particular brightness they had in the early fall when the dust settled and the sky seemed to move back from the earth. Colt woke and lay still in the darkness, listening to the changed air and then to Hector's breathing beside him, slow and even. The breathing of a man who slept without armor now, without the guard that 8 years of solitude had required. That breathing in the dark was one of the finest sounds Colt had ever heard. It was the sound of trust in its most basic form, the body's agreement that this was a safe place to be unconscious, a safe person to be unconscious beside. He didn't wake Hector. He just lay there in the cooling dark and listened and felt the season turning and thought about what it meant to have ridden toward something and arrived, actually arrived, not at a destination, but at a beginning. The kind of beginning that doesn't look like much from the outside. Just a man and a ranch and a worn-out range and work that never entirely ended. But that was, if you were inside it, everything. The morning after, Hector got up before dawn and made coffee and came back and set a cup on Colt's side of things without being asked. And the gesture was so ordinary that it was extraordinary. The ordinary intimacy of it. The assumption built into it. The you are here, and I am accounting for you." And Colt sat up and took the cup, and they drank together, while the darkness outside softened, and the first pale light came up over the eastern rim of the basin, and the new season arrived without ceremony. The way everything arrived in that country, without announcing itself, simply present, simply real, asking only that you be awake enough to receive it. Hector looked out the window at the lightening land. "You'll help me with the north fence today," he said. The tone of it was not a question, and not quite a statement. It was the tone of a man who has moved past asking and into the grammar of we, the quiet, permanent first-person plural of two people who have decided, without explicit negotiation, that their days go together now. Colt said yeah. He drank his coffee, the sun came up, the basin turned gold and then white, and then the morning was fully itself, indifferent and enormous and full of work, and the two of them were in it together, which was enough, which was, in the end, and in every way that mattered, exactly enough. There is a thing that happens in the West that no one who hasn't lived it can quite explain, which is that the land eventually becomes interior. Not in a sentimental way, not the way a person becomes attached to a place, the way they become attached to a possession, but in the way that a landscape gradually enters the body of the person who moves through it daily, becomes part of their balance and their breathing, so that to leave it would be a kind of surgery. Colt felt this happening to him without fighting it. He felt the basin becoming part of how he thought, its flatness and its heat and its particular quality of light entering his sense of time, slowing him from the inside out, curing him of the frantic forward motion that had characterized most of his 22 years. He had been running toward, he had told Hector. He had arrived. The running had stopped. What replaced it was something he had no previous word for. A daily returning, a daily choosing to be here, which was different from staying because you had nowhere else to go. This was staying because the place deserved it, because the man in it deserved it, because he deserved it himself, which was perhaps the hardest thing to believe and the most important. Hector watched this process with the quiet attention he gave to all growing things. He didn't comment on it. He didn't need to. He had waited 8 years for something to grow in the right direction, and he had learned, in that time, the particular discipline of not interfering with what was already going well. By the time the first cool winds came down from the north and the cattle began drifting toward the lower pastures as they always did, before a change in season, the ranch had the feel of a place that knew what it was. The fence lines were good. The water was holding. The new calves had found their legs. Peso had taken on a kind of proprietorial satisfaction in all of it, pointing out improvements to Gin with the pride of someone who could claim adjacency to good work. Gin, who had grown 2 inches since summer and was beginning to look less like a boy and more like whoever he was going to be. He absorbed all of it with the quiet attention of someone filing things away for later, when he'd need to know what a well-run life looked like. Colt noticed this. It mattered to him in a way he hadn't expected. The idea that the shape of what he and Hector were building might be something visible, something that could be read by the people working alongside them. Not as a lesson or a demonstration, nothing so deliberate. Just as a fact. A rancher and his partner, working land together, making something hold. He had spent enough of his young life feeling like a question mark, like something that required explanation or justification, and he was done with that. Done in the deep-settled way of a man who has found solid ground after too long in uncertain country and has no intention of leaving it. Hector, predictably, he had articulated this without words, and before Colt had fully thought it through. On an evening in early September, sitting on the porch in the new cool air with the last light going red on the horizon, Hector had looked at him with that complete, unhurried attention and said simply, "I'm glad you stayed." 3 words, the weight of them approximately equal to everything. Colt looked at the red horizon and felt the basin extending around them in every direction, the same land that had seemed so empty when he rode into it and that now felt so full, full of work and weather, and the slow accumulation of days lived right, full of horses and rope, and the smell of coffee in the early dark, and the sound of breathing beside him in the night. "I'm glad too," he said, which was true, and enough, and everything. Are outside the window of wherever you are listening to this story. Perhaps the wind is moving through something, through grass or through trees or through the gaps in old walls, and perhaps it sounds a little like the wind that moved through the Perdition Basin on the night of the first fall rain, when two men sat together inside a small house with a lamp burning on the table between them and the world outside doing what the world outside always does, which is going on and going on and going on, indifferent and enormous, and inside two people choosing each other, carefully, the way you choose something you intend to keep, 12 inches at a time, patient as rope work, strong as anything you ever built with your own hands. That is where we leave them tonight. Not at an ending. There are no endings in this story yet. Only the good, ongoing middle of a thing that has begun well. The north fence still needs work in the spring. The cattle will need moving when the cold comes in full. There is always, in that country, more to do. They will do it together. That is the promise written into the ordinary grammar of the way Hector says we now, the way Colt has stopped calculating exits and started calculating seasons, the way the rope hangs in the barn doorway, finished, strong, useful, meant to last. Some things in the desert take years to bloom, but when they do, they bloom with the particular conviction of things that survived everything before the flowering. They bloom like they mean it. They bloom like they intend to keep on. The fall came into the Perdition Basin the way Hector Vane did most things, without announcement, without theater. He simply present one morning where it had not been the morning before. Colt woke to find the air had changed overnight, carrying in it the dry leaf smell of turning seasons, and the light through the window had lost its white summer ferocity and taken on something amber, something more oblique, the sun coming in at a lower angle, as if it had reconsidered its approach. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory of this, the changed air and the changed light and the unchanged warmth of the room, which was Hector's room and had been Colt's room too for the better part of 3 weeks now, a fact that had settled into the fabric of the ranch's daily life with a naturalness that would have surprised Colt 4 months ago, and surprised him not at all now. He could hear Hector already in the yard. He didn't need to see him to know. The particular rhythmic sound of an axe working through wood, steady and unhurried, the sound of a man who splits firewood the way he does everything else, with complete attention and no wasted motion. Colt dressed and came out onto the porch with his coffee and stood watching for a moment in the early light. Hector's back was to him, broad shoulders moving with each swing, the pale morning catching the silver at his temples. He didn't acknowledge Colt's presence outright, but after the third swing, he said, without turning, "There is coffee on the stove." "I have some," Colt said. Hector gave a brief nod and kept working. Colt sat on the porch step and drank his coffee, and the morning arranged itself around them, and it was, in the way of ordinary mornings at the beginning of something long and good, and very nearly perfect. What no one tells you about the particular kind of wanting that Colt had been carrying since the third day on the vein spread is this: it does not diminish when it is answered. This is the surprise of it, the thing that the songs and the stories always get wrong. They treat desire as a tension that releases, a hunger that is satisfied, a fire that burns down once it has found its fuel. But what Colt discovered in those early fall weeks was that it worked the other way entirely. The wanting didn't diminish when Hector finally turned his hand over that rainy night and closed his fingers around Colt's. It deepened. It became more specific, more articulate, more aware of itself. He found himself wanting particular things, the exact quality of Hector's silence in the evenings, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking, the very specific warmth of standing beside him at the fence line in the cold morning air. He had traded in a general ache for 100 precise ones, each of them sharper and cleaner and altogether better than the vague longing that had preceded them. He mentioned this once, obliquely. He said, I thought wanting something would feel different once you had it." Hector looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup, with those eyes that never gave everything away at once. "Different how?" he said. "Quieter?" Colt said. Hector was quiet himself for a moment. Then he said, "Some things get louder when they're answered." He said it plainly, as a fact of experience, something he had arrived at by the usual route of living long enough. Colt held that for a moment and then nodded, because yes, that was exactly it. That was the precise truth of it, and the precision of Hector being able to name it made something in Colt's chest do the complicated thing it did sometimes when Hector turned out, once again, to already know the terrain that Colt thought he was exploring alone. In October, a man named Dre Solis rode onto the vein spread looking for work. He was perhaps 30, lean and quick-looking, with the kind of face that arranged itself easily into likability. Easy smile, easy posture, the practiced openness of a man who had learned to make good first impressions in strange places. He had references from a spread in New Mexico, well written and legible, and he rode a good horse and handled it well, and his tack was in honest condition, not new but maintained. Hector looked at the references and looked at the horse and looked at Dre and said, "I can use you for the drive in November, possibly through winter if you work out." Dre said that was fine, shook hands, and went to get his gear from his horse. Colt was at the water trough when this happened and watched it all from 20 feet away without participating, and felt something move through him that he identified, after a moment's honest self-examination, as jealousy. Not the dramatic, possessive kind, not the kind that makes a man loud or stupid, but the quiet, interior kind, the kind that is really just fear dressed in different clothes, fear that something carefully built is more fragile than it looks, that a new variable could shift the balance of things. He watched Dre unsaddle his horse with the competent ease of a man who had worked many spreads and knew his way around the expected motions, and he watched Hector watch Dre with the flat, assessing attention he gave to anything new on his land, and Colt felt the specific discomfort of not knowing what that assessment was finding. He went back to work. He said nothing about it that evening. He carried it like a stone in his boot, present, aggravating, and the kind of thing you told yourself you'd deal with later while continuing to walk on it. Later arrived sooner than he'd expected. Dre Solis was good company in the way that a certain kind of man is good company. He had stories. He had the ability to be funny without trying too hard. He could read a room or a yard or a dinner table and calibrate himself to it with the social fluency of someone who'd had to charm his way through enough new situations to have developed it into a skill. Peso liked him immediately, which was Peso's way. He liked most people, operating from a baseline of goodwill that was either admirable or naive depending on the day. Gin watched him with cautious curiosity. Colt watched him with something he was making significant effort to keep off his face. What Colt was watching for, specifically, was the way Dre looked at Hector. He understood, after the first 2 days, that this was perhaps more information about himself than about Dre. Dre looked at Hector the way you looked at any employer, with the attentive respect of someone trying to read what was required of them and supply it. He looked at the land the same way. He looked at Colt the same way. The man was, as far as Colt could tell after careful and somewhat exhausting observation, simply a competent ranch hand who had come to do a job and had no other agenda. The jealousy didn't fully dissolve at this realization. It lost its immediate edge, but something remained underneath it, a residue, and that residue told Colt something important about himself that he filed away for later examination. What it told him was that he was not as certain as he had believed himself to be, not uncertain of Hector. Hector was the most legible person Colt had ever known, once you learned the language, but uncertain of himself, of his own claim on what they had built, uncertain in the way of someone who had arrived at something good and had not yet fully believed that he deserved to stay. He thought about this for 3 days, and then, on the 4th night, lying in the dark with Hector's breathing steady beside him, he said it out loud. He said, "I got jealous of the new hand." He said it to the ceiling, not to Hector, which was a distinction that mattered. Hector didn't respond immediately. A minute passed, then he said, "I know." Colt said, "How?" Hector said, "You worked the south fence for 4 hours by yourself the day he arrived. You never work alone when there's someone available." Colt absorbed this, which is to say, he absorbed the fact that Hector had noticed, had tracked it, had understood it, and had been waiting, in his particular patient way, for Colt to arrive at it himself. "Why didn't you say something?" Colt asked. "Because," Hector said, "you needed to find the bottom of it yourself." He paused. "Did you?" Colt stared at the ceiling. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "What's the bottom?" Hector asked, and his voice was careful, not asking for reassurance, but asking for truth, which was a different thing entirely. Colt thought about the residue, the fear under the jealousy, the uncertainty about deserving. "I'm not always sure I'm supposed to be here," he said. Long pause, the night breathing around the cabin. Then Hector said quietly, with the weight of something decided long ago and not to be revisited, "You are." 2 words. Colt held them in the dark. He held them for a long time. Then something in him, some last clenched thing, loosened. The cattle drive in November was 3 days out and 3 days back and left everyone on the spread tired in the clean, accomplished way of physical work completed well. Dre rode flank on the 3rd day and did it without needing instruction, which earned him a nod from Hector that Colt had learned to read as the equivalent, in Hector's economy of expression, of considerable praise. On the ride back, Dre pulled up alongside Colt on the 2nd afternoon, and they rode in companionable silence for a while before Dre said, without particular emphasis, "You and the boss." He left it there, as an observation rather than a question. Colt looked at the horizon. "Yeah," he said. Dre nodded. "Figured as much," he said. Then he said, "My brother's the same way." He said it simply. He has information shared between men who are establishing where they stand with each other. And Colt felt the last of the stone in his boot dissolve. He glanced at Dre. "Your brother all right?" he asked. Dre smiled, the genuine version of his smile, which was different from the performed version in a way Colt could now distinguish. "More than all right," he said. "Found himself a good man in Santa Fe. They've got a small place. He looked good when I left him." Colt said, "Good," and meant it. Dre said, "Yeah." And they rode back to the vein, spread in the late afternoon, the cattle moving ahead of them in their slow bovine certainty, and the basin spreading wide in every direction, and the small cluster of buildings appearing on the horizon with the particular quality of a place that knows it is coming into view and has no need to announce itself. Hector was waiting at the gate when they came in, which was something he always did after a drive, standing there at the fence with his arms folded and his hat low, counting the herd and the men, and saying nothing until everyone was through, and the count was right. His eyes found Colt's as Colt rode through and held there for a moment. Not long, not dramatically, just the brief, private accounting of a man checking that what matters to him is intact. Colt gave a small nod. Hector unfolded his arms. "Good," he said to the general air, and went to help with the unsaddling. That evening there was whiskey on the porch, which Hector produced from somewhere inside the house with the air of a man who had been saving it for an occasion and had decided this was one. Peso received it with appropriate ceremony. Gin, who was perhaps old enough for it, and perhaps not, but had earned the day, held his cup with both hands and drank slowly and carefully. Dre took his with a nod and sat on the porch rail. Colt took his and stood beside Hector, shoulder to shoulder, not performing anything, simply standing where he stood, because it was where he stood, and felt Hector shift almost imperceptibly in his direction. The same half-inch settling he did at the end of good days, the bodily acknowledgement that the work was done, and the thing beside him was the right thing to be beside. The stars came out over the basin, which they always did in that country, as if they had somewhere important to be, burning bright and low and without mercy. Peso told a long, complicated story about a mule he had known in Del Rio that may or may not have been true, and that ended badly for the mule and well for everyone else. And Gin gestured his appreciation of the story, and Dre added a story of his own about a horse in New Mexico that Colt suspected was mostly true, and Hector sat quiet through all of it, with the whiskey in his hand and the stars above him and the spread before him, his life arranged around him in the dark, and at some point, Colt looked at him and saw on his face the expression he had been learning to read, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was what a smile was made of, the underlying material, and felt it arrive in his own chest like warmth from a good fire. Winter came. The basin received it differently than Colt had expected, not with the grudging resistance of northern country, not with the dramatic white transformation of higher elevations, but with a kind of austere acceptance, the way it accepted everything, just shifting its terms slightly, the cold coming in flat and dry and carrying a clarity that the summer heat never had. The mornings went silver. The horses grew out their winter coats and stood in the pasture like patient commentaries on endurance. The work changed but did not diminish. There was always, in that country, more work. Colt had found, over the months, that he had a particular aptitude for the kind of work that required patience. The slow, repetitive tasks that other hands often found tedious, but that he found meditative, that put him inside a useful rhythm. That let the thinking happen under the surface, while the hands did what the hands knew: fence repair, water management, the careful attention to small problems before they became large ones. Hector noticed this without commenting on it for a long time, and then one morning in early December said, "You have a feel for preventive work," and the observation was so precise and so apt and so unexpectedly touching in its precision that Colt was quiet for a moment before he said, "I learned from watching you." Hector looked at him with that look that was not quite a smile. Then he said, "You're better at it than I am," which was the most extravagant compliment Colt had yet received from him, and which landed accordingly. There was a night in December, cold and clear and absolutely still, when Colt woke at some small hour of the morning and found Hector awake beside him, lying on his back with his eyes open in the dark. This happened occasionally. Hector was a man who slept lightly, whose body had spent too many years in full vigilance to fully release it, even now, even here, even with the work of his days winding down, and the thing beside him at night as trustworthy as anything he had ever known. Colt lay still and waited. After a while he said, quietly, "What is it?" Hector said, "Nothing wrong, just awake." Colt said, "Tell me something." He didn't specify what. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I was building the south barn, the first year I was here, I hit a section of hardpan 6 inches down that went on for 30 feet. Couldn't get the post holes deep enough. Spent 2 weeks on it. Thought about leaving." Colt listened. He didn't ask why he hadn't left, because he had learned by now that Hector's stories moved at their own pace and arrived in their own time. After a moment, Hector said, "Finally figured out that if you come at hardpan from an angle instead of straight down, you can find the places where it gives. You just have to be willing to change your approach." He said this, and then he was quiet. Colt lay in the dark with the image of it. A younger Hector, less silver at the temples, standing at a line of inadequate post holes in the summer heat, reconsidering his angle. Then he said, "Is that why the south barn posts are set at that slight tilt?" Hector said, "You noticed that." Colt said, "First week." Hector made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then they were both quiet for a while. And then they both slept, and the night outside continued its enormous, indifferent work of becoming morning. Christmas in Perdition was a modest affair that the town treated as a combination of religious obligation and opportunity for commerce, both handled with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency that characterized most things in that country. Hector rode in on the 23rd for supplies and came back with flour and salt and dried beans and, unexpectedly, a small paper-wrapped package that he set on the kitchen table without ceremony and did not mention. Colt looked at it. Then he looked at Hector. Hector was putting away the dry goods and showed no awareness of the package. Colt said, "What's that?" Hector said, "Supplies." Colt said, "That is wrapped differently than supplies," Hector said, in the tone of a man whose cover story has been found insufficient and who has decided to simply wait out the situation. "There is another package on the table." Colt looked. There was, wrapped the same way. He picked it up and turned it over. His name was written on it in Hector's handwriting, which Colt had come to know from the ledger books and the fence repair notes and the occasional terse instruction left on the kitchen table. Spare, angular, the handwriting of a man who writes what is necessary and no more. He opened it. Inside was a small, flat knife in a leather sheath, the blade clean and practical, the handle wrapped in cord that matched exactly the cord Hector used for his rope work. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Hector, who had finished with the dry goods and was now studying the middle distance with the particular intensity of a man pretending not to watch for a reaction. "The cord on the handle," Colt said. Hector said, "Left over from the rope. I thought it would hold better than wood." Colt turned the knife over in his hands. He felt the familiar pull in his chest, the specific ache of being known, of having someone pay attention to what you are and make something from that attention. He looked up. Hector was watching him now, openly, with that expression, the one made of what smiles were made of. Colt crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put both arms around him, and Hector's arms came up without hesitation, without the half-second delay of a man deciding whether to receive something, and held on. And the kitchen was warm, and the winter outside was cold, and the basin stretched in every direction around the small house and didn't care about any of it, which was fine, which was exactly fine, because they cared about it themselves. The new year arrived on a Thursday, which struck everyone as slightly wrong, as if significant occasions should have the consideration to land on Saturdays or Sundays and not interrupt the working week. The basin celebrated it by producing a wind that came from the northwest and went on for 2 days, bending the dry grass flat and driving cold through every gap and every structure on the spread. And Colt and Hector spent those 2 days doing what the wind required, checking the cattle, reinforcing the barn doors, making sure the horses had what they needed. On the second day, Oz working in the barn, while the wind threw itself against the walls outside with a sound like continuous argument, Colt looked up from the water trough he was clearing and found Hector watching him from the barn doorway with his arms folded and his shoulder against the frame, and the expression on his face was the one Colt still occasionally caught him in, the rare unguarded one, the one that existed before Hector had decided how to present himself, the one that looked like what it was, which was a man regarding something he loved. Colt had been waiting for that word, not from Hector. Not aloud. He understood by now that Hector's vocabulary for interior things was specific and sparse, and that the word, when it came, would come in action rather than in speech. He would come in the cord-wrapped knife and the coffee cup and the half-inch settling and the hand turned over in lamplight. He understood all of this, but the expression on Hector's face in the barn doorway said it plainly in spite of all that, said it in the same language as everything else, direct, economical, without ornament, and Colt felt it land. He straightened up from the trough. Hector met his eyes. The wind kept going outside. Neither of them moved for a moment, content, it seemed, to simply be in the same space with what was between them. That warm and weighty thing, patient as the basin itself, meant to last. By February, Dre had decided to stay on through spring, and no one objected. He had proven himself in the ways that mattered. He worked without being managed. He didn't create problems he hadn't been hired to solve, and he had the useful quality of knowing when his presence was welcome and when the particular shape of a moment didn't include him. He rode into perdition alone on Friday evenings and came back Sunday mornings, which left the weekends on the spread with a particular quality of quietness that Colt had come to appreciate, a respite from the ordinary social arithmetic of 4 people navigating shared space, a 2-day reduction to the simplest possible equation. He and Hector used those weekends with the unhurried deliberateness of people who have learned not to take available time for granted. They rode the fence lines together in the mornings, not because it always required both of them, but because it had become one of the primary pleasures of Colt's life. Moving across the basin beside Hector in the early light, the horses stepping carefully through the frost-hardened grass. No particular need to speak. They read in the evenings, Hector with the ledger books, and the territorial land surveys he kept in a box under the table. Colt with whatever peso had most recently finished and left on the bunkhouse shelf, and the silence of the house held them both with the particular warmth of two people who have made themselves at home in each other's quiet. On one of these evenings, in the lamplight with a book open in his lap, Colt looked up and said, "Do you know how long I was trying not to watch you?" He said it lightly, not as confession or accusation, but as observation. The way you remarked on something in the middle distance. Hector didn't look up from his survey. "How long?" he said. "First week," Colt said. Hector turned a page. "I know," he said. Colt said, "You knew from the first week?" Hector looked up then, with that almost smile. "I knew from the first day," he said. "When you handed me that letter of introduction, you held it the way a man holds something he's not sure he should be putting down." Colt stared at him. "That is an extremely specific observation to make about a person you had met 30 seconds before." Hector returned to his survey. "I pay attention," he said, as if this explained everything. It did, in fact, explain everything. March brought the beginning of calving season, which is the time of year on any cattle spread when sleep becomes optional and patience becomes the primary professional qualification. Colt had been through one calving season before on his father's small operation in the Panhandle, but nothing that matched the scale of 500 head in the Perdition Basin, and nothing conducted with the particular focused intensity that Hector brought to it. The nightly rounds, the careful monitoring of the herd, the immediate and practical attention to any animal that needed it, the maintenance of complete composure at 2 in the morning in the cold and the dark when the fourth difficult birth in 12 hours was asking everything a person had. Colt discovered that he was good at this, which surprised him. He had never thought of himself as patient with animals specifically, as distinct from patient in general. But the calving season taught him that he had a quality of steadiness under pressure that he hadn't known he possessed, that he could function at the necessary level of calm attention in exactly the circumstances that required it. Hector noticed, as Hector always noticed, and on the morning of the third week, over coffee with the particular weary satisfaction of two men who had slept perhaps 4 hours and had a full day ahead, he said, "You're going to be a good rancher. Not you're doing good work, not you're useful, but a thing about who Colt was and what he was becoming, a statement about the long future of the thing," and Colt held it with both hands. On a night in late March, when the calving was at its most intense and everyone on the spread was running on black coffee and collective determination, Hector and Colt delivered twins. It was past midnight, cold and dark, the barn lit by 2 lanterns swinging in the draft from the open doors, and it required everything both of them had for the better part of an hour. When it was done, and both calves were breathing, and the mother had accepted them, and all 3 were alive in the straw, Hector sat back against the barn wall and looked at what they had made happen, and Colt sat down beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say. There was only the sound of the calves breathing, and the warm smell of the barn and the lantern light, and the fact of being side by side, the work done, and the world intact. After a while, Hector turned his head and looked at Colt, and his face was entirely open in the way it was only in these moments after extreme effort, when the container wore thin and the interior was visible. And what was visible was the same thing Colt had seen in the barn doorway in winter, and said the same thing in the same direct, economical, unornamented language. Colt looked back at him. The calves shifted in the straw. The lanterns moved. Colt reached out and put his hand on the side of Hector's face, just his palm against that jaw that had been decided upon firmly and not reconsidered, and felt the slight exhale, the release of something held. And Hector closed his eyes for a moment and leaned into the touch the way a man leans into warmth when he has been cold for a long time and has finally come in from the wind. They stayed like that for a while, in the barn in the middle of the night, while the newborn calves breathed and the rest of the basin went on outside, large and cold and full of its own ongoing business. There was a week in March when Colt got sick. It came on gradually, the way sickness does when a man ignores the early signals, because there is too much work, and the early signals seem like excuses. He woke one morning with his chest heavy and his throat raw and the particular lightlessness behind the eyes that meant fever was building, and he dressed anyway and went out into the cold morning and got through the first 2 hours of work before Hector looked at him across the water trough and said simply, "Go inside." Colt said he was fine. Hector said, "You are not fine." Colt said, "I can manage." Hector set down what he was holding and crossed the yard and put the back of his hand against Colt's forehead with the same practical directness he applied to everything, and Colt stood very still and let this happen, and Hector said, "You have a fever. Go inside." And his voice was the same temperature it always was, but underneath it was something different, something that had a shape Colt recognized by now, the particular quality of Hector's concern, which was not soft and not dramatic, but was as real and as solid as the fence posts he drove into the earth, as real as anything he had ever built. Colt went inside. He lay down on the bed and listened to the sounds of the spread going on without him, the horses, the voices of Peso and Dre in the yard, the wind in the gap under the barn door. He slept for a while and woke to find a cup of something hot on the table beside him and a blanket he had not had before laid over him with the quiet efficiency of someone who had moved through the room without waking him. He lay in the warmth and thought about the first morning he had woken in this room, the unfamiliar sensation of a morning without loneliness. And then he thought about Hector in the barn doorway all those months ago, working the rope in the lamplight, 12 inches at a time, and the thought curved into something warm, and he slept again. That evening, Hector came in from the late rounds and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at him in the lamp's low light with the expression he reserved for things that mattered to him, the unguarded one, the one that existed below the management. "How do you feel?" he said. "You better," Colt said, which was true. Partly, the fever had broken sometime in the afternoon and left him wrung out but clear, the way recovered ground looks after a flood, raw and newly mapped. Hector nodded. He stayed in the chair. He didn't pick up a book or a ledger. He just sat there in the lamplight with his hands loose on his knees, not performing watchfulness, but simply present, the way he was present with injured animals, with struggling calves, with anything that needed the particular quality of his attention. Complete, patient, without an agenda beyond the simple fact of not leaving. Colt watched him through half-closed eyes and felt something move through him too large and too warm to contain, something that pooled in his chest and stayed. He didn't try to name it. He had given up naming it months ago. He just held it the way you hold something precious, carefully, aware of the weight of it, grateful for what it cost and what it gave in equal measure. "You should sleep," Hector said eventually. "I know," Colt said. Neither of them moved. Hector looked at the lamp. Then he said quietly, "To the lamp or to the room or to no one in particular, I don't like it when you're not well." 4 words, the economy of them typical, the weight of them not. Colt looked at him. Hector was still looking at the lamp. Colt said, "I know," which was the truest thing he could say, that he knew, that he felt it in the particular quality of Hector's silence, and the chair pulled close, and the blanket laid over him in the afternoon. That it was not nothing to this man when Colt was not well. That it mattered. That Colt mattered. In the specific and irreplaceable way that something can matter when it has been chosen deliberately and continued to be chosen every subsequent day. He knew. He felt it every morning and every evening, and in the long middle of the days spent side by side on this land, and he was grateful for it in a way that went beyond words, the way you were grateful for water in dry country, not abstractly, not philosophically, but in your bones, in your throat, in every part of you that knew what it was to do without. He was better by morning. He went back to work, and the spread received him without comment, the horses indifferent, Peso giving him a single assessing look and then returning to his coffee, Dre nodding from across the yard. And Hector, who had been at the fence line since before dawn, looked up when Colt came out and said nothing. But his shoulders did what they did, that almost imperceptible settling, and Colt crossed the yard and picked up a hammer and went to work beside him, and the morning arranged itself around them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Spring completed itself. The basin greened briefly in the way it did, shyly and partially, the hard earth producing small, persistent things in the lowlands where the winter rain had pooled. Colt rode the fence lines in the new light and felt, under his ribs, the sensation he had been cataloging all winter, and had now given up trying to name, and had simply accepted, the warm, weighted, specific sensation of a life that was his, a place that was his, a person beside him who was there deliberately and without reservation. Some days, the sensation was quiet and backgrounded, and he carried it without thinking. Some days, usually the ones when the light was doing something particular over the basin at dusk, it surfaced and was briefly enormous, and he just stood in it, the way you stood in good weather, neither analyzing nor performing, just present. Hector, predictably, had his own version of this that he expressed in his own way, which was through maintenance. He had been spending his evenings working on the front porch railing, which had needed replacing since before Colt arrived, and which he was now replacing with something considerably better than what had been there before. Good wood, properly fitted, with the same quiet craftsmanship he brought to everything. Colt watched this project progress over the weeks and understood it as a form of statement. The railing was better than what was required. It was the railing of a man who expected to be on this porch for a long time, who was building accordingly, who had stopped building for the minimum and started building for the long view. Colt sat on the step one evening and watched Hector test the new section and said, "That's going to last 20 years. Hector looked at it. "At least," he said. Colt looked at him. Hector looked back. "At least," he said again, and the words carried everything they were meant to carry, and the evening light did what it always did, and the basin stretched in every direction, and the porch railing was solid and true, and meant to last. The rope still hung in the barn doorway. Colt noticed it every morning when he crossed the yard. And the noticing had become part of his morning in the way that certain landmarks become part of a route. Not consciously attended to each time, but present, reliable, a point of reference that the body registered even when the mind was elsewhere. It was a good rope. It had held up through the seasons, through the cattle drive, through the daily work that ropes were put to, on a working spread. It would go on holding up. It was made right. He was standing in the barn doorway one morning in early spring, one hand on the hanging rope, thinking about the water trough that needed attention in the north pasture, when he heard Hector behind him, the particular cadence of his boots on the hard ground, the sound he would have known in any crowd or any darkness by now, as distinctive as a voice. He didn't turn around. Hector came and stood beside him in the doorway and looked out at the morning, which was doing something admirable with the light, the low sun catching the dew on the dry grass and turning the whole field silver for a few minutes before the heat came up and burned it off. "You remember the first morning you walked in here?" Hector said. Colt said, "I remember." Hector looked at the rope. "You were watching the whole time," he said. "Not quite an accusation. Something warmer than that." Colt said, "I was curious about rope work." Hector made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Brief, low, genuine, the real thing. Colt had been collecting Hector's laughs the way some men collected land or cattle, hoarding them as the valuable things they were. This one he added to the collection and held it there. He turned and found Hector still looking at the rope with the expression of a man who is pleased with something he has made. The rope and everything since, Colt thought. All of it measured out and worked in, 12 inches at a time, nothing rushed, nothing skipped, each section folding into the next without weakness or gap. He looked at Hector's profile in the morning light, the jaw and the temples and the eyes that held the surface still while everything moved underneath, and he thought, yes, this is what I rode toward. This is what I found. Here is where we leave them, not at an ending. Not at the kind of conclusion that Western stories traditionally offer. The villain down, the land secured, the final sunset ride. Because this story was never that kind of story. This was a story about the time before the dramatic events, and after them, and in between them, The long, ordinary middle of a life being built right, the daily choices and the quiet work, and the accumulated weight of two people deciding over and over in 100 small ways to be where they are. It was a story about rope work, about patience, about the things you build when you stop rushing and start paying attention, about what happens when a man who has been alone long enough finally lets someone through the gate he spent years constructing, and what that costs him, and what it gives him in return, and how those two things are not in competition with each other, but are, in fact, the same thing. The vein spread will go on. The cattle will be moved, and the fences will be repaired, and the water will be managed, and the seasons will turn, as they always turn in the basin, without sentiment, without ceremony, simply happening one after the other, each one requiring what it requires and offering what it offers. Peso will tell his stories on the porch. Jin will grow into whoever he is going to be. Dre will ride in on Sunday mornings with the particular ease of a man who has found a place that suits him. And Hector will work the land the way he always has, with that complete attention, that patient precision, that refusal to rush what needs to build slowly. Except that now there is someone beside him who has learned his language and speaks back in it, who has become native to the same silences and the same light, who has traded in a general sense of forward motion for the specific and daily and altogether more demanding discipline of arrival. And Colt will stand at the barn doorway in the mornings with his coffee, one hand on the rope, watching the basin go gold in the early light and feeling, under his ribs, the warm weighted thing that he stopped trying to name and simply carries now, the way you carry something that has become part of you, without thinking about it most of the time. And then sometimes, when the light does something particular, you think about it, and it is enormous. That is where we leave them, in the good ongoing middle of a life built on solid ground, in the particular quality of that desert light, at the hour between afternoon and evening, the hour with no name in any language. Two men on a porch in the fall, shoulder to shoulder, watching the basin go from gold to amber to the deep red of the last of the sun, saying very little, needing to say very little, the rope in the barn behind them finished and hanging and strong, everything that has been built between them holding the same way, because they built it right, because they took their time, because some things are only good when they are not rushed, and this was one of them, and they knew it, and they stayed. Wherever you are listening tonight, whether the wind outside your window sounds like the basin wind or like something entirely different, whether you know this kind of silence or only imagine it, I hope this story found you somewhere you needed it. The West was a hard country that asked hard things of the people who lived in it, and the hardest thing it asked, as it always is, was not the physical endurance or the drought or the cold or the distance to the nearest town. The hardest thing it asked was to be honestly who you were, in a landscape that had no patience for pretending, that stripped everything down to the working truth of a person, and asked what was left. What was left, in Hector and in Colt, was enough, more than enough. The kind of enough that builds porches meant to last 20 years and ropes that never fail under the hand. Subscribe and tell us where you are listening from tonight. Come back tomorrow and there will be another story from the West, where the land is unforgiving and the silences are deep, and sometimes, in the middle of all that harshness, two people find each other and build something that the wind cannot touch. I am grateful you were here.